Hey y'all, welcome to the final Keepsake Box sidebar. I know, I'm sad too, but I got a little surprise for y'all, so don't start crying just yet. This sidebar is going to be a little different. We're going to discuss the episodes, of course, but we're also going to talk about some other things that have gone on, current and upcoming. But before we get into any of that, y'all know we have to recap. The last sidebar covered episodes 13 through 16. Those episodes basically covered the turn in David and Shelonda's married life. They got home from Belize with Juanita, and David immediately started showing who he really was. He starts to mistreat Juanita because he feels that she's trapped, and he's not the most respectful towards Shelonda either. Shelonda and Juanita realize that David's doing drugs, which helps to explain the escalation in his behavior. Realizing that things aren't going to get better for Juanita, Shelonda offers Grandma's house to her as a way out. They devise a plan and think that it has worked. Only David comes home one day and advises Shelonda that he has known about her affair with Juanita the whole time, due to the cameras that he's placed in the house. He also knows that she's stashed Juanita away at Grandma's, but he's done something to both Juanita and Grandma's house, in addition to forging her name on documents that gave him control of all of her assets. Oh yeah, he destroyed her credit too. So she's stuck, and David starts making her life miserable, even worse than he was doing to Juanita. So Shelonda decides to devise a plan. Now that we're caught up, let's get into the sidebar. Episode 17, Phase 1, Flirt with the Disaster. David starts slipping further and further into his drug habit, so much so that he doesn't really care about keeping up the appearance of the perfect marriage. I mean, he still played the part to some degree, but Shelonda states that he didn't really take her out and do things with her, and those were the things that he had typically done to keep up the front. The only plus was the fact that David started doing drugs in front of Shelonda, which gave her an opportunity to assess how he reacted to each drug, which didn't always work out well for her. Some of the drugs made him pretty violent. Sidebar. I really be reaching for entertainment value. That whole P3 box thing was something that came pretty easily. I mean, it's not really hard to think of 3 drug-related things that start with the letter P. My mind pulled that out of nowhere, and I was kind of excited about it. Pills, powders, and patches. Boom. But something else had to happen. If you remember from the previous chapter, things got worse for Juanita because David's drug use escalated from the drugs that they all took to the P3 drugs, the pills, powder, and patches. I don't really know specifically what any of those drugs are. Use your own discretion. But once Juanita was gone, Shelonda became the new Juanita, and I needed her to experience something that shadowed Juanita's experience for dramatics. I wanted David's maltreatment of her to be the result of another escalation in his drug use. So I had to add another drug. At that time, it wasn't so easy because nothing immediately jumped to my mind. So what did Shandora, the researcher, do? I researched. I looked for drugs that started with the letter P to make an addition to the P3 box. After looking through a few, I didn't find anything that really felt right. So I thought about what I wanted to happen to David. I wanted him to pass out. And heroin is going to make you pass out. So the solution seemed to reside in finding alternate names for heroin, and that's where Povo came from. It worked out perfectly because the word is Spanish-based, so it would make sense that she heard it from Juanita, because Juanita is from Belize, whatever. Anyway, she speaks Spanish, so I went with it. Anyway, Shelonda found out that he was involved in she realized that she was involved in an escalated version of the life that Juanita lived in that house. So she devised a plan which she separated into 4 phases. Phase 1. After David passed out from heroin, Shelonda went into his phone. It was only her intention to find the camera app so she could learn how to manipulate it. But in going through the phone, she realized that David had a tracker on her car and a recorder on her phone. Suddenly, it made a lot of sense. David wasn't as intuitive as he would have her to believe. He just had great apps. Shelonda got the information for the camera, car tracker, phone recorder apps, and downloaded them onto her own phone. She downloaded the banking app too. We're going to assume that she was able to go into the settings and find the login and password information, because that's the only way any of this could have worked out. Anyway, that starts phase 1. Basically, Shelonda had to see if she could manipulate the apps. But as the The title of the episode states she was flirting with disaster because if David had figured it out, y'all already know what would have happened. I'm not going to meticulously go through each step, but basically she paused the tracker and drove for a further distance. She paused her phone and called Cream. She paused the camera and cleaned David's bathroom and then turned it back on. When David got home, he mentioned that she was a mile over. Had she messed up and not paused the app right, he would have noticed that she drove an extra 10 miles. He mentioned her conversation with Mandy, but not her conversation with Cream, so she knew he'd only heard what she wanted him to. And she paused the camera when she cleaned his bathroom. While looking at the footage, he was obviously under the impression that she never went into his bathroom, but that's when she paused the camera. And even though he beat the mess out of her, she was very much aware of the fact that she had accomplished her goal, and that felt like success. Episode 18, Phase 2, Cream Connection. After a few conversations, Shelonda meets with Cream. Cream looks terrible. She had a little ponytail and everything. Cream admits that she fell into the underbelly after the club burned down and after Antonio died. For the first time, Shelonda realized that Cream lost Antonio too because he wouldn't ever have let her fall down that far. Also, the strip club was like family, but she had fallen into the hands of people who didn't care to at least somewhat keep her straight. Shelonda had planned to give Cream a generic version of her life, only giving her the impression that she was there to help her. But then she realized the disservice that she had placed upon herself by trying to fit into that world. So she told Cream everything. She said she started at the beginning, which for her was the beginning that started with Antonio's death. For the first time, they discussed what happened when Sharon killed Antonio, and that's when Cream drops the bomb. She tells Shelonda that it wasn't just Antonio and Sharon who had conspired to set her up. She and Peaches were a part of it too. They were supposed to get Shelonda hooked on drugs, so it would be easier for Antonio to either get her to be a stripper or a prostitute. Shelonda was really hurt, but when she thought about it, Peaches had crossed her up with the money, and she still loved her. Antonio had crossed her with that whole setup, and she still loved him. None of those things mattered after those people had passed away, so she forgave Cream. If this was real life, I'd wonder if she really forgave Cream, or if she just needed her. I guess she did because of what happened at the end. Anyway, Shelonda really breaks down her life with David, and Cream says, "You've been going through it, ain't you, look Anyway, they agree to help each other, and they devise an unspecified plan. Episode 19, Phase 3, The Trigger. I issued a disclaimer prior to this episode because I knew some people would be like, wait a minute, this already happened. I didn't want you guys to think that it was some kind of weird mix-up. I love the way this episode plays out because it literally starts out with the exact same verbiage from the beginning of book 1. Well, in this case, season 1. At the beginning of this podcast in season 1, Shelonda is making breakfast for David and making sure that everything is perfect. He comes out and she has everything set up. The beauty of having this happen at 2 different points in time in the same project is the ability to connect with it differently. At the beginning, she goes through this scene and asks herself how she became that person. She talks about how she's leader of the pack within her circle of friends and how her little sister looks up to her. Then she states that she was groomed to be that person and says, let me explain. It pauses and we go back to Shelonda's life from the beginning, starting with her feeling ugly, etc. Now, here we are 2 seasons later, and this scene is layered so much more heavily because now we know how she got here. We know that Ron groomed her. We know that his abuse made Ken more appealing and also made her more desensitized to Ken's abuse. She feels like Ken saved her. We know that Antonio came along and basically trumped Ken. She was able to look past a lot with Antonio because he was so much more than she felt Ken was. He saved her. And now we know that David came in with the promise of something so amazing and ended up being the biggest monster of them all. But most of all, we realized that she really was groomed to be that person. Like now we can see it. Shelonda lived a crazy life, but no matter how much she grew and experienced, she still had some of the same issues that made her susceptible to people who didn't have the best intentions. And that's because she was still very wounded inside. We know this because of the way she internalized the things that David said. Like a person with a different self-esteem probably would have brushed it off, but she internalized it and she took it hard. All he had to say was that she wasn't good enough, and that was enough to break her. So yeah, looking at it 2 seasons later, I think it absolutely feels different. But in season 3, the story continues, versus season 1, where that's the moment where she reflects on it all. This is when you find out that it's actually their anniversary. David comes home with purple orchids like he does for every other anniversary. Being the butthole that he is, he says that he wants to eat at 7 o'clock instead of 7:30, attempting to create an obstacle to her successfully managing what he's asked. But Shelonda takes it in stride. She cooks chicken, asparagus, and homemade mashed potatoes that he requested, and had it all done on time. Funny thing about that, I mentioned that she used boxed potatoes and just boiled one for chunk factor, a trick that she got from Juanita. These books came out in 2020. It's 2024 now. A few months ago, my niece posted on social media that she had tried that trick and it sucked. She couldn't remember who told her to try it. Of course, I responded and reminded her that it was in the book. This girl said, "Oh yeah, and I just knew it was going to be good because David didn't play." Anyway, after dinner, Shelonda implements the next part of the plan, the trigger. Shelonda tells him that she thinks it's a good time for them to work on their relationship since it's their anniversary, and that has always been a special day for them. She also says that she wants to start back talking about getting Cassidy, and that's what triggers David. He goes on this rant about how she hasn't ever been good enough and how he wouldn't ever want to work things out with her. But the biggest thing that came out of the conversation was David's admission that he had choked Juanita with his bare hands and buried her somewhere. He admits that he enjoyed killing Juanita, burning down her grandma's house, and seeing her face when he came home and delivered the news. He told her that he thinks about killing Juanita when he rapes her, and that makes it easier for him to touch her. He also admits that he hadn't ever planned to get Cassidy. He said that he could barely tolerate Shelonda. So he knows that he can't tolerate someone who operates at a lower mental level than her. The shiest. But Shelonda isn't hurt like she would have been in times past, because she needed David to say those things so she could feel better about what she was about to do. She knew he'd give it to her. Episode 20, Phase 4. Time's up. Shelonda knew David was going to get the P4 box because that was his new nightly routine. How she knew he was going to do the drug that was going to make him pass out that night, I don't know. Let's just assume that the plan may have been altered if he had snorted some coke and stayed up fighting her all night. I don't know. But that's not what happened. David took something that knocked him out pretty quickly. It says 30 minutes. Shelonda paused the cameras in the house and set her phone on the couch. She went into David's bathroom and found him passed out, just like she knew he'd be. She had some second thoughts for a second, but then she reflected on the life that she lived with him and the words that he had just spoken, and it was a go. She already had everything set up, so she took the drugs that he had snorted and put them into a bag. Then she injected the drugs that she had gotten from Cream into his vein, making sure to put his fingerprints on the needle. She sat there and watched as he had a seizure and vomited. She watched as he threw up the contents of the last meal that he ever demanded of her. Baked chicken, asparagus, and those dang boxed potatoes with the one boiled potato for chunk factor. And also, I think it's crazy because she reflects on the moment when he proposed to her and said, "Promise you'll be here with me until the day that I die, by my side until the day that I die." And she says, "I knew he never thought that it would happen this way, but I'm here until the day that he died, just as I promised." Also, the shyst. But she sat there and she watched it because she said she needed to commit it to memory because she needed to know where her life had gone because she had failed to put herself first. After watching, she went back and sat on the couch. Once she was in the correct position, she turned the cameras back on, knowing it would look like she never left the couch if somebody watched the film. She erased the entire memory of the camera in David's bathroom, though. The rationale? She didn't say it, but my rationale while writing it was, if someone had asked to see the camera footage, they'd wonder why it didn't show David injecting himself. So she deleted all of the footage, like the camera wasn't ever operational. That way, it wouldn't look like only that specific portion of the recording was missing. Yes, I watch a lot of murder shows. But after turning on the cameras, she walked down the hallway, turning on the cameras. She walked down the hallway, getting footage of herself going into David's bathroom to, quote, unquote, find him. Phase 4 was Shelonda's act after David's death. She went outside yelling and screaming, something that she knew she had to do to look credible. But she found that she was genuinely in a place of hurt in the process. Shelonda starts crying about all the hurtful things that happened in her life, and that was the catalyst for the tears that she shed on that day. And when it came down to it, none of her extreme preparation was even warranted. It was accepted that David had an overdose, and that was that. Shelonda deletes all of the cameras and permanently turns on her banking app. She put the drugs in her phone with the vomit on it into her keepsake box. Then she goes to a hotel and gets a great meal and a massage on David. What followed was an endless cycle of people wanting to be a part of the action. Y'all know how people do, posting their last conversations with him and such, some of which were brief and generic. Shelonda found out that he was involved with like 5 other women, and she didn't even care. She was just happy that David would be bothered that she logged into his social media. Shelonda did a bunch of press conferences advising against doing drugs, but really she just wanted to expose David because she knew that would bother him. They go to the funeral and Shelonda gives David a purple orchid. She decides it's no longer her favorite flower. She invites Chad, Mandy, Sean, and Tina to ride in the limo, only because David would be bothered by her placing Sean in a situation where he was forcibly exposed to Tina. They go to the burial where Mandy tells her, "Good job." She repeats Shelonda's verbiage about everyone deserving to be happy and free, which cues Shelonda into the fact that Mandy has figured things out. Mandy tells her that she's leaving Chad, and Shelonda agrees to assist her financially. I mean, she knows her secret, right? Shelonda lowers David's body into the ground to the sound of Where Do Broken Hearts Go, knowing how badly he hated that song. She really hated that man. Think about the way she described burying Antonio and the way she described burying David. She said she put Sharon and Antonio away nicely. This girl played David's least favorite song to spite him after his death. He couldn't even hear it. Shelonda played David's game and forged all of his documents. Thus, she was a multimillionaire. And when going through his things, she realized that he found Cassidy and that she was living with Sharon's mom, which is Ron's sister. She wasn't about to let that stand, so she paid her and had Cassidy come and live with her. She built a house for them on Grandma's land and gave Cream David's house. Episode 21, Time to Let Go. Shelonda gets Cassidy and spends her time catching up with her. But at a certain point, she realizes that she's still going back and looking at the contents of the keepsake box. She actually says something profound. Now, I'm a keeper of things. Not to that point, but I like to keep things that remind me of times and people. But if you had a literal box of every big thing that happened in your life, could you stay out of it? Even if the things evoke negative memories, could you stay out of it? But you realize that even the negative things were attached to people that she had loved and lost. This is when the entire premise of the keepsake box becomes relevant. She stops to think about the fact that it's not just a literal keepsake box. She realizes that she has not only been collecting physical things, but she has been hoarding the feelings that were connected to those things as well. And that's the main idea here, like the point of the whole project. We all have a keepsake box, but it's emotional. Nothing is infinite. So if you collect enough of anything, that space is going to become crowded. It's going to become heavy. Your emotions are no exception. The whole point is, Shelonda had hoarded so much in her emotional keepsake box, and it all played out every time she pulled out the actual keepsake box. She realized that it was all very heavy, and living in the past made it difficult for her to move forward with her future. So she buried the box, deciding not to ever revisit the actual box or any of the feelings that were associated. Side note, somebody read this book and told me they thought she was going to dig a hole for the box and find out where David buried Juanita. Now that would have been a turn. Anyway, Shelonda fulfills her and Cassidy's desires, but she finds that she's bored. Consequently, she decides to get a job at a bank. It's mundane, but her life had been so eventful that she needed something that was calm and ordinary. She goes to work on a Friday, and it's a beautiful spring day. She listens to Where Do Broken Hearts Go, and she feels good. She doesn't think about any of the men. They order Chinese at work, and she gets her favorite. General Tso chicken, lo mein with no onions, and extra broccoli. Of course. It's the end of the workday, and they're struggling to get the line down. They want to go home for the weekend. They usually lock the door at 4:45. But at 4:40, an armed man comes into the bank. He automatically shoots the security guard. Everybody is panicked, as they should be. But Shelonda isn't, because she recognizes him. It's Ken. Ken jumps over the counter and tells her to put the money in the bag, or he'll blow her head off or something. The bank has a policy in place, and she knows she's supposed to hit the silent alarm, but she's at an impasse. She realizes that she still has a soft spot for him, and she feels guilty for being associated with him going to jail 2 other times. On the other hand, she feels that Philip deserves justice. She feels like she wants to do the right thing, but something happens. Ken looks into her eyes, and he's crying, and that has always been a trigger for her, even when he cried because he got caught up with the whole Melanie cheating scandal. To layer it, he says, "I look in your eyes, and I know that you still care for me." A line from Where Do Broken Hearts Go? She folds like origami. She bypasses the silent alarm, and just like she had done in every other instance with Ken, she did what she was told. That's the end of the Keepsake Box, y'all. I know, I hate to see it end too, but here's a surprise. Last year, I decided that I wanted to start working on spin-off books for some of the Keepsake Box characters. The obvious choices were Ken and Antonio, but I've since developed some mental storylines for Peaches and Cream, so I think I'll do them too. But the Ken book is already written and available for purchase. All of my books are available for purchase on Amazon, by the way. The Ken book is titled Menace, the Ken Story, because he was a menace. I went back and forth about what I'm about to say for a couple of reasons. This podcast was created as a promise to myself. I wanted to do a storytelling podcast where I created stories for the sole purpose of telling them on the podcast. I didn't have any stories written, but I wanted to honor the promise that I had made to myself to start. So I started telling the story of something that I'd already had written, just to start. And because this was 3 books, I knew that I could do it for a while. But now we're at the end. I have to decide what's next. Being that the Ken book is already finished and published, it made sense to make that the next story to tell. My issues were 1, he's a guy and I'm not, so that's weird. 2, y'all probably don't know this, but I don't curse. Ken, however, does curse. I know, that's weird, but I wanted it to be credible. And let's just face it, Ken had to curse. So in thinking it out, I've decided to work my way around it. The next story up is the Ken story. It focuses on his life outside of Shelonda. I mean, she's in it. She'd have to be. But it's about him. And it's good too, y'all. I mean, it's crazy good. Keep it in line with that. I've decided to start writing the Antonio story while I'm doing the Ken podcast. And maybe writing the Cream or Peaches stories when I get around to doing the Antonio podcast. Yes, I think it's a good idea to keep to all the keepsake related things up here. It just feels right. And I'm also doing an episodic series called The Franklin, Virginia Show. That's crazy good too. As far as I'm concerned, it's easily going to be 100 books related to that series, but I only have 1 published. I don't want to neglect it because I'm emotionally connected to it and I need to do it. That being said, there may be a delay putting the projects out because I'm only one woman, baby. In my 90s Jade voice. I don't know if y'all old enough to know who that is, but anyway, that's the new plan. I'm going to keepsake the mess out of this podcast, and we'll see where it goes from there. Thanks for sticking this out with me, and I hope y'all enjoyed it as much as I did. Coming up next, Menace, the Ken story. Let's go. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Chinney Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to purchase books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Thank you for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome.